My name is Sarah Mitchell. And for 26 years, I believed that love meant sacrifice. I believed that being a good daughter meant swallowing my dreams, my voice, and my sense of self to keep everyone else comfortable. I was wrong, but it took me nearly 3 decades and a broken engagement to figure that out. Growing up in a middle-class family in suburban Ohio, I was always the responsible one. While my younger brother Jake got to be the golden child who could do no wrong, I was expected to be the family's emotional support system and financial safety net. My parents, Linda and Robert Mitchell, had perfected the art of emotional manipulation disguised as parental love. Every conversation somehow circled back to what I could do for them, what I owed them, or how disappointed they were in my choices when those choices didn't align with their expectations. The pattern started early. When I was 16 and got my first job at a local coffee shop, my mother convinced me to hand over half my paycheck to help with family expenses. She explained that my father's construction business was struggling, and as a family, we all needed to pitch in. At 16, this seemed reasonable, even noble. I felt proud to be helping my family through a difficult time. What I didn't know was that my parents had been living beyond their means for years, using credit cards to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford while expecting me to subsidize their poor financial decisions. Throughout high school, while my friends were saving for prom dresses and college funds, I was working 30 hours a week and handing over my earnings to keep our electricity on and our refrigerator stocked. Jake, meanwhile, got a weekly allowance for doing absolutely nothing. When I questioned this disparity, my mother would launch into a guilt-inducing speech about how I was naturally more responsible and how Jake needed more guidance. The subtext was clear. I was expected to be the adult in the family, even as a teenager. College should have been my escape, but instead, it became another chain. I had earned a full academic scholarship to Northwestern University, achievement that should have been celebrated. Instead, my parents saw it as an opportunity to extract even more from me. They convinced me to take out student loans for living expenses, and then pressured me to send most of that money home to help Jake through his senior year of high school. They painted it as temporary help, promising they would pay me back once my father's business recovered. During my sophomore year, I met David Chen in my economics class. He was everything I thought I wanted: stable, ambitious, and from a family that seemed to have their act together. David's parents were both professors, and their dinner conversations revolved around literature, politics, and ideas, rather than who owed what to whom. Being with David felt like stepping into a different world, one where relationships weren't transactions and love wasn't conditional on financial contribution. We dated through college and into our early 20s. David knew about my family situation, and initially, he was supportive. He understood that I sent money home regularly and that family obligations often took precedence over our plans. However, as our relationship deepened and we began talking about marriage and future plans, cracks started to show. The first major red flag came during our senior year when David suggested we move in together after graduation. I was excited about the prospect until my mother called that evening with another emergency. This time, Jake had crashed his car, and they needed money for repairs and increased insurance premiums. The amount they requested was exactly what I had saved for the security deposit on the apartment David and I had found. When I told David the first would need to delay our move-in date, he was understanding but clearly frustrated. After graduation, I landed a good job as a marketing coordinator at a pharmaceutical company in Chicago. Finally, I thought, I would have enough income to help my family and build my own life. I was naive to think the demands would decrease rather than increase. Now that I had a real job, my parents' expectations skyrocketed. They convinced me to co-sign a loan for a new truck for my father's business, assuring me it was just a formality and that they would never miss a payment. They also began asking for larger and more frequent financial contributions, always framed as temporary assistance that would be repaid. David and I finally moved in together 2 years after graduation, and for a while, things felt stable. He had started law school, and I was climbing the corporate ladder. We talked about getting engaged, about buying a house, about the future we would build together. These conversations always filled me with excitement, until my phone would ring with another family crisis that required my immediate financial intervention. The pattern was always the same. My mother would call, crying about some emergency. My father's truck would break down. Jake would need money for textbooks, or there would be an unexpected medical bill. Each time, they would emphasize how desperate the situation was, and how I was their only hope. They would promise repayment and shower me with gratitude, making me feel like a hero for saving the day. But the promises were always empty, and the gratitude was always short-lived. By my 25th birthday, I had lent my family over $40,000. None of it had been repaid. My own savings account was nearly empty, and I was living paycheck to paycheck despite earning a decent salary. David was becoming increasingly concerned about our financial situation, especially when he realized that I had been quietly funding my family's lifestyle for years. The beginning of the end came when David proposed. It was a beautiful moment, in the same coffee shop where we had first met, with a ring that represented months of saving on his part. I said yes immediately, overwhelmed with joy and love. We began planning our wedding, looking at venues, and dreaming about our life together. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving towards something that was truly mine. 3 weeks after our engagement, my mother called with the biggest emergency yet. Jake had been arrested for driving under the influence, and they needed $15,000 for a lawyer to keep him out of jail. This wasn't Jake's first run-in with the law, but my parents insisted that this time was different, that he had learned his lesson and just needed one more chance. They explained that if Jake went to jail, he would lose his job and be unable to support himself, which would mean they would need even more financial help in the long run. The amount they requested was exactly what David and I had saved for our wedding. Every penny we had carefully set aside for the reception venue, the photographer, the flowers, and the dress I had been dreaming about since I was a little girl. When I hesitated, my mother's tone shifted from pleading to accusatory. She reminded me of everything they had sacrificed for me, how they had supported my education and my dreams, and how disappointed she was that I would prioritize a party over my brother's future. That night, I sat in our apartment staring at the engagement ring on my finger, while David worked late at the law library. I felt trapped between two futures, the one I was building with the man I loved, and the one I felt obligated to fund for my family. The weight of their expectations pressed down on me like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. When David came home that night, I told him about my mother's call. His reaction was immediate and firm. He sat down beside me, took my hands, and said, "Sarah, you cannot give them our wedding money. This has to stop." His words hit me like cold water. For the first time, someone was telling me that I had a choice, that I didn't have to sacrifice everything for my family's poor decisions, but the pressure from home intensified. My mother called multiple times a day, crying about Jake's situation and their desperation. My father, who rarely got involved in these conversations, called to tell me how disappointed he was in my selfishness. Jake himself sent me a series of text messages, alternating between begging for help and lashing out at me for abandoning him. The emotional manipulation was relentless, and I felt myself weakening under the assault. David tried to be supportive, but I could see the strain in his eyes. We had multiple difficult conversations, where he tried to help me see how unhealthy my family dynamic was. He pointed out that they never asked Jake to contribute financially to family emergencies, that they never thanked me for the money I had already given them, and that they seemed to view me as an ATM rather than a daughter. Intellectually, I knew he was right, but emotionally, I felt bound by years of conditioning that told me I was responsible for their well-being. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. David and I were having dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, trying to finalize our wedding plans despite the ongoing crisis with my family. We were discussing the menu options when my phone rang. It was my mother, and against David's gentle suggestion that I let it go to voicemail, I answered. Through tears, my mother informed me that they had decided to take out a second mortgage on their house to pay for Jake's legal fees, since I was too selfish to help my own brother. She explained that this meant they would lose their home if anything went wrong, and that it was my fault for forcing them into such a desperate situation. She then delivered the final blow. If I truly loved my family, I would call the lawyer and arrange to pay the $15,000 myself, saving them from risking their home. As I sat in that restaurant, listening to my mother sobbing on the phone while David watched with a mixture of concern and frustration, something inside me snapped. It wasn't anger, exactly, but a sudden clarity that cut through years of fog. I realized that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. There would always be another emergency, another crisis that required my sacrifice. I was not their daughter. I was their insurance policy. I told my mother I would call her back and hung up the phone. David reached across the table and took my hand, asking if I was okay. For the first time in my adult life, I answered honestly. No, I said. I'm not okay. And I haven't been okay for a very long time. That night, we went home, and I made the hardest decision of my life up to that point. I called my parents and told them I would not be giving them money for Jake's legal fees. I explained that I needed to prioritize my own future, and that I could no longer be their financial safety net. The reaction was immediate and vicious. My mother screamed that I was destroying the family. My father called me selfish and ungrateful. And Jake sent me a text message telling me he hoped I was happy ruining his life. The next few weeks were torture. My family launched a campaign of emotional manipulation that would have impressed a military strategist. They called constantly, sent guilt-inducing text messages, and even reached out to extended family members to pressure me. My aunt called to tell me how disappointed my late grandmother would have been in my selfishness. My cousin sent me a Facebook message about the importance of family loyalty. The assault was coordinated and relentless. David was my anchor during this period. He helped me see that their reaction proved his point about the toxicity of the relationship. If they truly loved me, he argued, they would understand my position and respect my boundaries. Instead, they were doubling down on the manipulation, trying to guilt me back into compliance. He suggested I consider seeing a therapist to work through the complex emotions I was experiencing. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s, who specialized in family dynamics and codependency. In our first session, she asked me to describe my family relationships, and as I spoke, I began to see patterns I had never noticed before. She introduced me to concepts like emotional enmeshment and financial abuse, terms I had never heard, but that described my experience perfectly. Through therapy, I began to understand that my family had groomed me from childhood to be their financial provider. They had systematically undermined my sense of self-worth, convincing me that my value lay in what I could give them, rather than who I was as a person. Dr. Walsh helped me see that setting boundaries wasn't selfish. It was necessary for my mental health and my future. The process of establishing boundaries was painful and messy. I started small, screening my calls and setting limits on how often I would engage with my family's drama. When they demanded explanations for my new behavior, I practiced phrases, drive. Walsh had taught me, I understand you're upset, but this is my decision, and I'm not comfortable discussing this right now. Meanwhile, my relationship with David was healing. As I became more confident in setting boundaries with my family, our communication improved dramatically. We were able to move forward with our wedding plans, and for the first time, I felt genuinely excited about our future together. David was patient and supportive as I worked through years of programmed guilt and obligation. 3 months after I had refused to pay for Jake's lawyer, my mother called with news that surprised no one except possibly herself. Jake had been convicted of the DUI and sentenced to community service and probation. The $15,000 lawyer had been largely ineffective, and my parents had indeed taken out a second mortgage to pay for his defense. They were now struggling with higher monthly payments, and were, predictably, looking for someone to blame. This time, when my mother called asking for money to help with their mortgage payments, something was different. Instead of the familiar pang of guilt and obligation, I felt a strange sense of calm. I listened to her explanation of their financial difficulties, her tears about possibly losing their home, and her not-so-subtle implications that this was all my fault. When she finished, I simply said, I'm sorry you're going through this, but I won't be sending money. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was cold and controlled. I don't know who you've become, Sarah, but you're not the daughter I raised. I realized she was right, and for the first time, I was grateful for that fact. David and I were married in September, in a beautiful ceremony that we paid for ourselves. My parents attended, but the atmosphere was tense and strained. They barely spoke to me, and left immediately after the reception. In their absence, I was able to truly enjoy what should have been the happiest day of my life, surrounded by friends and extended family members who loved and supported me without conditions. Our honeymoon in Italy was the first vacation I had taken in years, where I didn't spend the entire time worrying about money or checking my phone for family emergencies. For 2 weeks, David and I explored Rome, Florence, and the Amalfi Coast, and I felt lighter than I had in years. I was building a life based on my own choices, rather than other people's expectations. Returning to real life after the honeymoon, meant facing the ongoing challenge of maintaining boundaries with my family. They had not given up on their attempts to extract money from me, but their tactics had evolved. Instead of direct requests, they began using more subtle forms of manipulation. My mother would call to update me on their financial struggles, always ending these conversations with sighs about how hard things were and how they didn't know what they were going to do. Dr. Walsh helped me recognize these conversations for what they were: continued attempts to make me feel responsible for their problems. She taught me strategies for redirecting these discussions and setting firmer boundaries. When my mother would start down the path of financial complaints, I learned to say, "That sounds really stressful, Mom. Have you considered speaking with a financial counselor?" Or, "I hope things improve for you. How about we talk about something else?" The holidays that first year of marriage were particularly challenging. My family had always used family gatherings as opportunities to apply collective pressure for financial assistance. Christmas dinner became a minefield of passive-aggressive comments about money, subtle digs about my selfishness, and pointed discussions about how difficult their lives had become since I had abandoned them. David and I left early that Christmas, and in the car on the way home, I made another difficult decision. I told him that I thought we needed to limit our exposure to my family's toxicity, at least until they could learn to respect our boundaries. The next year we spent Christmas with David's family, and the difference was remarkable. His parents asked about our lives, our careers, our hopes for the future. They never once asked us for money, or made us feel guilty for our success. Meanwhile, Jake's problems continued to escalate. 6 months after his DUI conviction, he was arrested again, this time for possession of controlled substances. My parents' response was predictable. They called me, crying about legal fees and how they couldn't afford another lawyer. When I refused to help, my father accused me of wanting to see my brother in prison. The accusations stung because it forced me to examine my true feelings about Jake's situation. Did I want him to face consequences for his actions? Yes. Did I want him to go to prison? No. But I had finally learned that wanting someone to be okay and being responsible for making them okay were two entirely different things. Jake was an adult who had made choices, and he needed to face the consequences of those choices. My protecting him from those consequences had only enabled his destructive behavior. This realization marked a turning point in my recovery process. I began to understand that my family's dysfunction wasn't just about money. It was about a fundamental inability to allow people to experience the natural consequences of their actions. By constantly rescuing Jake from his mistakes, my parents had prevented him from learning and growing. By constantly demanding financial support, instead of addressing their own spending problems, they had avoided taking responsibility for their situation. As I grew stronger in my convictions and more confident in my boundaries, my family's attempts to manipulate me became more desperate and more cruel. My mother began calling me at work, crying about how I had destroyed the family and ruined Jake's life. She sent me long emails detailing their financial struggles and reminding me of everything they had sacrificed for me over the years. When those tactics failed, she tried a different approach, sending me old family photos with captions about how much she missed the loving daughter I used to be. The photo campaign was particularly painful because it forced me to confront the reality of what I was losing. I was losing the fantasy of the loving, supportive family I had always wanted. I was losing the hope that someday my parents would see me as more than a source of income. I was losing the dream that Jake would get his life together and become the brother I had always tried to help him be. But I was also gaining something invaluable: my self-respect. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based on what was best for me and my marriage, rather than what would keep my family happy. I was learning to trust my own judgment, instead of constantly second-guessing myself based on their reactions. David and I bought our first house 18 months after our wedding. It was a modest 3-bedroom colonial in a quiet neighborhood, with a small garden and space for the children we hoped to have someday. The down payment came from money we had saved together. Money that wasn't owed to anyone or earmarked for someone else's crisis. Walking through our empty house on the day we got the keys, I felt a sense of accomplishment and ownership I had never experienced before. My family's reaction to our house purchase was typically self-centered. Instead of congratulating us or expressing happiness for our success, my mother immediately began calculating how our increased housing costs would affect my ability to help them financially. She actually said, during the one phone call where I mentioned the house, "Well, I guess this means you definitely won't be able to help us with anything now." Her comment crystallized something for me. In her mind, Every dollar David and I spent on our own lives was a dollar stolen from her. Our success, our happiness, our progress toward our goals, all of it was viewed through the lens of how it affected her access to our money. This wasn't love. It was ownership. She didn't see me as a daughter. She saw me as a resource. Around this time, Dr. Walsh introduced me to the concept of gray rock, a technique for dealing with manipulative people, where you become as uninteresting and unresponsive as possible. Instead of engaging with my family's emotional manipulation, I began giving brief, factual responses to their communications. When my mother would call crying about their latest financial crisis, I would say, "That sounds difficult," and then change the subject or end the call. The gray rock technique was surprisingly effective. My family's manipulation tactics required my emotional engagement to work. When I stopped providing that engagement, their power over me diminished significantly. They could still make me feel guilty or sad, but they could no longer make me act against my own interests. This period of establishing boundaries and learning new communication strategies wasn't without its costs. I lost several family relationships that I had valued, including my relationship with my favorite aunt, who sided with my parents in what she saw as a family conflict. I also struggled with periods of doubt and guilt, wondering if I was being too harsh or if I should give my family another chance. Dr. Walsh reminded me during these moments of doubt that healthy relationships don't require you to sacrifice your well-being for someone else's comfort. She helped me see that my family's unwillingness to respect my boundaries or acknowledge their role in our problems was evidence that I was making the right choice in limiting contact with them. The real test of my new boundaries came 2 years later when my father suffered a heart attack. He survived, but the medical bills were substantial, and my family immediately began pressuring me to help with the costs. This time, however, their approach was more sophisticated. Instead of directly asking for money, they shared details about his condition and the financial stress they were under, clearly expecting me to offer assistance. I did want to help. Despite everything that had happened, I still loved my father and was genuinely concerned about his health, but I had learned to separate my emotional response from my actions. Instead of offering money, I researched financial assistance programs for medical bills and sent my mother information about payment plan options and charity care programs. I offered to visit my father in the hospital and to provide emotional support, but I didn't offer financial assistance. My family's reaction to this approach was telling. They weren't interested in the resources I had researched or the emotional support I offered. They only wanted money. And when it became clear that I wouldn't provide it, they became hostile and accusatory. My mother actually told me that she wished I had never been born because, at least then, we wouldn't have to deal with the disappointment of having such a selfish daughter. That comment, meant to devastate me, actually had the opposite effect. It clarified the conditional nature of my mother's love in a way that no amount of therapy could have done. She was essentially saying that my value to her was entirely dependent on my financial contributions, and that without those contributions, she would prefer I didn't exist. Instead of crushing me, this revelation was liberating. It freed me from any remaining guilt about my decision to establish boundaries. David and I celebrated our 3rd wedding anniversary at the same Italian restaurant where we had been sitting, when I finally decided to stop funding my family's dysfunction. As we sat at our table, talking about our plans to start trying for children, I reflected on how much my life had changed. I had a healthy marriage, a beautiful home, a growing savings account, and most importantly, a sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on other people's approval. The decision to limit contact with my family had been painful, but it had also been necessary. I had learned that love shouldn't require you to sacrifice your dreams, your financial security, or your mental health. Real love supports your growth and celebrates your success rather than resenting it or trying to profit from it. My relationship with my family never fully recovered, and I made peace with that reality. We exchanged holiday cards and occasional polite text messages, but the deep, meaningful connection I had always hoped for was never going to happen. They had made it clear that they were only interested in a relationship where I provided financial support, and I had made it clear that I was no longer available for that role. Instead, I focused on building chosen family relationships with people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. David's family welcomed me with open arms, and I developed close friendships with colleagues and neighbors who supported my growth and celebrated my successes without expecting anything in return. When our daughter Emma was born 2 years later, I held her in my arms and made a silent promise that she would never be taught that her worth was dependent on what she could give to others. She would learn that she was valuable simply because she existed, not because of what she could provide to make other people comfortable. Looking back now, I can see that the hardest part of my journey wasn't learning to say no to my family's financial demands. The hardest part was learning to believe that I deserved to have my own dreams and to pursue my own happiness. For so many years, I had been convinced that wanting things for myself was selfish, that being a good person meant sacrificing everything for others. I learned that the opposite was true. Taking care of myself, setting boundaries, and pursuing my own goals didn't make me selfish. It made me healthy. It allowed me to be a better wife, a better friend, and, eventually, a better mother. I couldn't give love authentically when I was bitter and resentful about my sacrifices. I couldn't build healthy relationships when I was operating from a place of obligation rather than choice. The financial abuse I experienced from my family was insidious because it was wrapped in the language of love and family loyalty. They convinced me that giving them money was how I showed love, and that refusing to give them money meant I didn't care about them. It took years of therapy and the support of a healthy relationship to help me understand that real love doesn't bankrupt you, emotionally or financially. Today, David and I have a marriage built on mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine affection. We make financial decisions together based on our priorities and values. We support each other's dreams and celebrate each other's successes. Our daughter is growing up in an environment where she sees healthy boundaries modeled and where her worth isn't tied to what she can do for others. I still sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had continued to enable my family's dysfunction. Would Jake have eventually gotten his life together if I had kept paying for his mistakes? Would my parents have learned to manage their finances if I had kept bailing them out? I'll never know, and I've learned that it doesn't matter. I can't control other people's choices or outcomes. I can only control my own. The girl who used to lie awake at night worrying about her family's next crisis and calculating how much money she could send home is gone. In her place is a woman who sleeps peacefully because she knows that other people's emergencies don't constitute her responsibility. I learned that I could love my family without sacrificing myself for them, and that setting boundaries wasn't an act of cruelty but an act of self-preservation. My story isn't unique. Millions of people struggle with family dynamics that blur the lines between love and manipulation, between helping and enabling. The patterns that trapped me for so many years are common in families where dysfunction is disguised as closeness, and where financial abuse is masked as family obligation. If there's one thing I want people to take from my experience, it's this. You are not responsible for fixing other people's lives, even if those people are family. You are not obligated to sacrifice your dreams, your financial security, or your mental health to make other people comfortable. Love doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. The process of breaking free from these patterns is difficult and often painful. You may lose relationships that you value, and you will almost certainly face guilt and criticism from people who benefited from your previous willingness to sacrifice yourself. But on the other side of that pain is a life that belongs to you, relationships based on genuine mutual respect, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you're living according to your own values rather than someone else's expectations. I am no longer the family ATM, the perpetual rescuer, or the daughter who exists primarily to solve other people's problems. I am a wife, a mother, a professional, and a woman who has learned that her worth isn't measured by what she can give to others, but by the authentic life she has chosen to build. And that life, difficult as it was to claim, is more beautiful than anything I could have imagined when I was trapped in the cycle of obligation and resentment that once defined me. The silence that filled my life when I stopped being available for every crisis wasn't empty or lonely. It was the sound of peace, the sound of boundaries being respected, and the sound of a life being lived on my own terms. And after years of noise, chaos, and constant demands, that silence was the most beautiful music I had ever heard.